Right now, you probably believe a story about money that you've never once questioned, because it's the same story basically every economics textbook has been telling for 200 years. Once upon a time, the story goes, people had no money at all. If you had extra fish and needed a new axe, you'd wander around until you found someone with a spare axe who happened to want fish, and you'd trade directly, one for the other. This worked fine until it didn't, because eventually people got sick of hunting down that one specific person who wanted exactly what you had. So humanity invented money to fix the problem. It's a clean story. It makes intuitive sense. Economists have been repeating some version of it since Adam Smith wrote it down in 1776. And it's probably exactly what you were taught in a school textbook at some point, illustrated with a cartoon of two farmers awkwardly holding out a chicken and a sack of grain toward each other. And according to actual anthropologists who spent their career studying real human societies, both past and present, it has never once been documented happening, anywhere, ever. Picture an actual small farming village, several thousand years before coins existed anywhere on Earth. Someone's cow just had a calf, and a neighbor's roof just caved in during a storm, rain pouring straight through into what used to be a dry kitchen. The neighbor doesn't walk over with a chicken to trade for wood. He just says, "I need some help with my roof." And people show up carrying tools and spare timber, because that's what you do for someone you're going to be living next to for the rest of your life. Nobody's standing there with a mental ledger, calculating exactly how many logs equal exactly how much labor before agreeing to lift a single beam. The whole arrangement runs on a much simpler principle. I'll help you now, you'll help me later. And everyone in the village silently understands who currently owes who a favor, sometimes for years at a stretch, without a single object ever changing hands to mark it. That's not barter. Economists have a name for what that actually is, and it's a lot closer to money than anyone expected. In 2011, anthropologist David Graeber published a book called Debt: The First 5,000 Years, built around a genuinely startling claim, one that drew on decades of prior anthropological fieldwork, rather than inventing the idea from scratch. Graeber pointed to the work of Cambridge anthropologist Caroline Humphrey, who had reviewed the ethnographic record across dozens of documented societies, from Native American communities to farming villages across Africa and Asia, and reached a blunt conclusion. No example of a barter economy, pure and simple, has ever been described, let alone the emergence from it of money. All available ethnography suggests that there never has been such a thing. Not one confirmed case anywhere in the historical or anthropological record of a society that ran primarily on direct person-to-person barter before inventing money to fix it. What actually shows up instead, over and over, in tight-knit communities across the world, is something closer to informal credit. You take your neighbor's cow because you need it, and everyone understands you now owe him one. An obligation that might get repaid in a completely different form entirely, months or years later, or might simply get folded into the long, ongoing relationship between two families who are going to be trading favors back and forth for the rest of their lives anyway. Graeber's argument flips the textbook story completely on its head. Humans didn't start with barter, discover money, and then invent credit as a convenient upgrade. If anything, something like credit and debt came first, tracked entirely through memory and reputation within a small community. And cash showed up later, specifically for situations where you couldn't rely on trust, dealing with a passing stranger, a rival tribe, or someone you had no ongoing relationship with and might never see again. To be clear, this isn't a settled argument that everyone in economics accepts without pushback. Critics, including economist George Selgin, have pointed out a real logical gap in Graeber's reasoning. The absence of documented historical barter doesn't necessarily prove barter never happened. It might simply mean that wherever barter did become genuinely inconvenient, societies solved the problem so quickly that no clear historical trace of a pure barter economy ever survived long enough to be recorded by the time anthropologists showed up centuries or millennia later to study them. Selgin compares it to a chemist refusing to believe an unstable radioactive isotope ever existed, just because nobody managed to observe one directly before it decayed into something else entirely. Other economists have raised a related point. Barter clearly does happen in specific, documented situations even today. Refugee camps, prison economies, and emergency situations where the usual currency has collapsed or isn't available, which at minimum shows humans are perfectly capable of falling back on direct trade when the social trust that credit requires simply isn't there, even if it was rarely the founding system of an entire economy. That's a fair, serious rebuttal, and it's worth holding both ideas at once. Barter almost certainly happened in specific situations, especially between total strangers who had no ongoing relationship and no reason to trust each other, while something closer to communal credit and reputation likely handled the vast majority of everyday exchange within a single community. So when does something you'd actually recognize as money first show up in the historical record? Long before coins, and in a form you'd probably never guess, one that looks a lot less like a shiny object and a lot more like a spreadsheet. At Sumerian sites in ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists have recovered clay tablets recording debts stretching back to roughly 3500 BCE, some of the oldest written records human civilization has ever produced, predating anything you'd recognize as literature, philosophy, or history by well over 1,000 years. Meaning writing itself may have been invented largely to keep track of who owed what to whom. These weren't poems or royal decrees. They were bookkeeping. This person owes this many measures of barley to this temple, due by this date, sometimes with interest calculated directly into the record. Archaeologists have found thousands of these tablets, entire archives of them, essentially ancient filing cabinets, full of nothing but who owes whom what. The Sumerian unit of value, the shekel, wasn't originally a coin at all. It was a specific, standardized weight of barley, the actual grain, used as the reference point for pricing everything else in the economy, from land to labor to silver. Money, in other words, appears to have started life not as a physical object changing hands in the moment, but as a unit for measuring and recording debt on a clay tablet, a system of accounting that existed for well over 1,000 years before anyone struck the first coin. Cattle tell a similar story, and left an even stranger trace behind, inside the English word itself. The Latin word for money, pecunia, comes directly from pecus, meaning cattle or livestock, and the English word capital traces back to the same root as cattle and chattel, a linguistic fossil pointing straight back to an economy where four-legged animals genuinely were the wealth, a connection so old that most English speakers use all three words today without any idea they're related. Somewhere in the deep history of early economies, a cow wasn't just a cow. It was a walking, breathing unit of accumulated wealth, a way of storing and displaying value long before metal coins existed to do the same job more conveniently. Picture a family standing beside their small herd, watching it graze on a hillside. That herd wasn't just future meat and milk. It was their retirement fund, their dowry payments, their insurance against a bad harvest, all visibly grazing in front of them. You didn't necessarily trade a cow for a specific number of baskets of grain on the spot. You simply understood, as a matter of shared social knowledge, roughly what a healthy cow was worth relative to everything else, the same way you intuitively understand what a $100 bill is worth today, without needing to personally verify it against a barrel of oil. Here's where the story gets almost impossible to believe, and it comes from a tiny Pacific island most people have never heard of. On the island of Yap, in what's now the Federated States of Micronesia, the local currency for centuries was an object called rye. Massive circular limestone discs, sometimes reaching 12 feet across and weighing several tons, quarried from limestone deposits on a different island entirely, over 250 miles away, and hauled back to Yap by canoe across open ocean. Picture that journey for a second. A raft lashed together from tree trunks, a multi-ton stone disc balanced precariously on top, towed behind a wooden outrigger canoe across open Pacific swells for days at a time. No engine, no modern rope, nothing but human paddling and whatever the weather decided to do. It was a genuinely dangerous journey that reportedly cost some crews their lives. Storms capsizing rafts and dragging both stone and sailors beneath the waves. And that danger wasn't incidental to the stone's value. It was part of the point, woven directly into how valuable a given stone was considered afterward. A rye stone that nearly killed the men who brought it home was, by definition, worth more than one quarried on a calm day, because the value baked into the object was never really about the limestone itself. It was about the story of what it took to get there. Once a rye stone finally made it to Yap, here's the part that should stop you cold. Nobody moved it again. The stones were simply left standing wherever they landed, sometimes propped up along a path or outside a meeting house. Entire rows of them eventually forming what looked almost like a small stone gallery in the middle of a village. And ownership of a given stone changed hands purely through spoken agreement and communal memory. Everyone in the community simply knowing and accepting who currently owned which enormous rock. It gets stranger still. According to island oral history, one particularly large and valuable rye stone was being transported by canoe when a storm hit, and the massive stone slipped beneath the waves, sinking to the bottom of the ocean, never recovered, never seen again by human eyes. Any modern insurance adjuster would call that a total loss. And the Yappies decided, as a community, that this genuinely didn't matter. The stone's owner didn't lose his wealth. Everyone agreed the rye was still exactly as real and exactly as valuable, sitting on the ocean floor, as it would have been sitting in the middle of the village. Because its value was never really about the physical rock at all. It was about the shared social agreement of who owned it and how much everyone collectively agreed it was worth. A community had built a fully functioning monetary system almost entirely out of consensus and memory, with the physical object practically optional. A detail so strange that when Western economists first heard about it, some of them assumed the story had to be exaggerated folklore, right up until they realized it wasn't actually so different from how their own banking systems worked. If that sounds bizarre, sit with this for a second. Modern money works almost exactly the same way, just with better bookkeeping software. Most of the dollars, euros, or whatever currency sits in your bank account right now aren't physical bills stored in a vault somewhere with your name on them. They're numbers in a database, a modern equivalent of a Sumerian clay tablet, tracking who is owed what by whom, verified entirely through collective trust in the system doing the record keeping correctly. Nobody's driven out to inspect a literal gold bar every time your paycheck lands. You just trust the number on the screen, the same way a Yappies villager trusted that a rock at the bottom of the ocean still counted. If every bank's servers vanished tomorrow, along with every backup, the actual physical wealth of the world wouldn't disappear. The farms and factories and buildings would all still be sitting exactly where they were. But the record of who owned how much of it would collapse instantly into total chaos, which tells you something important about what money actually is. It was never really the paper or the coin or the stone. It was always the agreement. Cowry shells tell a related story across an even wider stretch of the ancient world, one of the longest-running currencies in the whole of human history. Small, glossy seashells from the Indian Ocean and Pacific, cowries were used as currency across huge swaths of Africa, South Asia, and East Asia for well over 3,000 years, moving along trade networks that stretched thousands of miles from where the shells were actually gathered, sometimes traveling from a single set of shallow tropical reefs all the way to inland markets that had never seen an ocean in their lives. Nobody needed the shells for any practical use. You couldn't eat one, build with one, or wear one out through use the way you would a tool. Their value came entirely from broad, widespread agreement that they were valuable, durable enough to last for generations without rotting or breaking, and hard enough to fake or counterfeit that everyone accepted them as a reliable store of worth. That's not so different from the underlying logic behind a modern $100 bill, an object that's practically worthless as paper and only means anything because an enormous number of strangers who will never meet each other have all silently agreed to treat it as if it does. The first actual coins, stamped metal discs meant to be a standardized portable unit of value, don't show up in the archaeological record until around 600 BCE in the Kingdom of Lydia in what's now Western Turkey, made from a naturally occurring gold-silver alloy called electrum, stamped with an official royal design specifically to guarantee the weight and purity of the metal without anyone needing to weigh or test it themselves every time. Before that stamp existed, verifying a lump of precious metal meant weighing it on a scale, testing its purity, and trusting whoever handed it to you not to have secretly mixed in something cheaper. The coin's entire innovation was compressing all of that verification into a single, official, instantly recognizable mark, something anyone could glance at and trust immediately, without needing scales or expertise of their own. Compare that to the Sumerian debt tablets from 3500 BC, and you get a genuinely startling gap. Something recognizably like an organized system of money and debt was running for roughly 2,900 years, more than 100 generations, before anyone, anywhere, thought to strike an actual coin. Entire civilizations rose, built monuments, fought wars, and collapsed again, all while running economies on clay tablets and trusted weights of grain, long before a single coin ever jingled in anyone's pocket, which should tell you that a coin was never actually necessary for a functioning economy in the first place, just a convenient later refinement. So what does all of this actually mean? Money almost certainly wasn't invented in a single flash of insight to fix an inefficient barter system that mostly never existed in the first place. It was something closer to an idea that kept getting reinvented in wildly different physical forms. Barley weight, cattle, oversized rocks nobody moved, seashells nobody used, stamped metal, and eventually numbers in a database. Precisely because the actual invention was never really the object at all. It was the shared social agreement underneath it, the simple, fragile, and remarkably durable trust that everyone involved agrees this specific thing represents value, and will keep agreeing tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day after that, for as long as the agreement holds. Every one of those systems, from Sumerian barley weights to Yapese stone discs sitting untouched on the ocean floor, ultimately depended on the exact same fragile ingredient: a community small enough, or trusting enough, or bound tightly enough by ongoing relationships, that everyone could simply agree on value without needing a physical guarantee changing hands every single time. Coins, and eventually paper money, didn't replace that trust. They were simply a clever workaround for situations where you couldn't count on it. A way to do business with a total stranger you'd never see again, and had no particular reason to trust. Someone passing through your town once and never again. Someone from a rival tribe you couldn't rely on the way you'd rely on a lifelong neighbor. So the next time you tap a card, transfer money on your phone, or hand someone a bill for a coffee, you're not really using some ingeniously engineered replacement for prehistoric barter. You're participating in the exact same act of collective trust a Yapese villager extended to a rock at the bottom of the ocean, or a Sumerian farmer extended to a mark scratched into wet clay. An agreement, held by an enormous number of people who mostly don't know each other, that this specific thing means something, right up until, collectively, everyone quietly decides it doesn't. History is full of moments where exactly that happened. Currencies collapsing overnight the instant enough people stopped believing. Hyperinflation turning a wheelbarrow of banknotes into barely enough to buy a loaf of bread within the span of a single afternoon. Which tells you something important that no economics textbook barter story ever quite captures. Money was never really about solving a logistics problem. It was, and still is, one of the largest shared acts of imagination the human species has ever managed to sustain. An agreement so deeply embedded in daily life that most people go their entire lives without ever once stopping to notice it's an agreement at all. Right up until, somewhere, it briefly stops working. If you liked pulling apart a story you've probably repeated as fact without ever checking it, that's exactly what this channel does every single episode. Digging past the tidy version everyone assumes is true to find the messier, more interesting reality underneath it, week after week. New videos go up regularly, so subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one.